Greetings! This time, we examine North Korea's economy and politics since Kim Jong-un came to power in 2011. It has been already 13 years. After Kim Jong-un's rise, many changes have occurred in North Korea. First of all, with the consecutive nuclear tests and missile launches, UN sanctions have intensified. As a result, the regime has ramped up efforts to evade sanctions. Even as the North Korean economy struggles to break the vicious circle of isolation caused by sanctions, Kim Jong-un must continue to provide privileges to the elite who politically support him. Second, political economy of real estate and smuggling also stand out. Notably, Pyongyang's skyline has transformed to surprise many North Korea observers and show some economic progress in a close authoritarian regime. At the same time, black market of smuggling along the North Korea-China border creates a political and social dynamic that differs from that of Pyongyang, the heart of North Korea. We have outstanding lineup of lecturers here. Dr. Pavel P, a visiting scholar at the Asia Center of Seoul National University, presents on current urban planning projects in Pyongyang, North Korea's most prized area. Professor Justin Hastings from the University of Sydney tracks and explains the alternative trade routes North Korea has sought to overcome sanctions. Dr. Robert Winstanley-Chesters from the University of Edinburgh focused on North Korea's fishing industry, analyzing it through the lens of dining politics. Finally, through a lecture by Professor Adam Cathcart from the University of Leeds, we can gain insight into the patterns of smuggling along the North Korea and the China border.
So today I'm going to tell you something about urban development in Pyongyang and try to shed light on the hidden patterns which we usually don't think about. I will start with a brief introduction, what Pyongyang is from the urban studies perspective. Then, as you required and you offered, I will talk about 3 points: socio-spatial inequalities in Pyongyang, real estate market, and how does activization of urban development in Pyongyang influence the economic development in the country. So let's get started. Before I will present the results, I want to explain you what kind of methodology and what kind of sources do I use. The thing is that my major is urban geography. So usually for me, the main source is a map. But since we are living in the 21st century, of course, the main source for us is satellite images. But I have a chance for field trip and on-site observation. However, it is not really possible to observe everything, while the satellite images in historical perspective, they give us a unique chance to analyze the patterns of development in the city, and this is very useful. And of course, I use first and secondary sources as well as interviews with the factors and experts in the field. So let's get started with a brief introduction of what Pyongyang is. We all hear many rumors around Pyongyang, right? It's a mysterious city, it's a sacred place. So Pyongyang has a very long history, right? Because according to the mythology, Pyongyang served as the first capital of the ancient Korean country, Gojoseon. However, today, Pyongyang is very different. The population is about 3.2 million inhabitants. And the thing is that Pyongyang is a privileged city because only privileged people can. We have to understand that to live in the city is actually, they give you a privileged status from the beginning, because those who live in all the cities, they are how to say, their place in the social hierarchy, according to the local standards, is higher than those who were unfortunate who was born in the rural areas. So Pyongyang, how do North Koreans maintain the size of Pyongyang? There are a couple of local laws, and what is important is that migration to Pyongyang is strictly prohibited, as well as to another cities in North Korea. To migrate to another city or another place, you have to obtain a special permission. That's how North Koreans institutionally, how to say, prevent urbanization development and try to protect the city size. So this is a crucial part of North Korean urban policy. And the thing is that only those who made a significant contribution to the country's development can migrate to Pyongyang. Other people, they just cannot. Since I'm a scholar in urban studies, I have to tell you that it's very significant that there is no suburbs in the sense we understand it. Suburbs didn't form around Pyongyang. It says a lot about the city and about the policy, urban policy, which the locals implement to freeze the urban development around the capital. Let's check out how Pyongyang was developing. We all know that the city was the main theater of the Korean War, during the Korean War, and of course it was almost completely destroyed. However, under the influence of the Soviet Union and socialist bloc countries, the city started to be reconstructed from the 1950s. And you probably heard this phrase, Pyongyang Spit, right? And so this is the term the locals use to describe this significant construction campaign which held in North Korea to reconstruct its cities, primarily Pyongyang, of course. But we have to point out that Pyongyang always has a long story of apartment of shortage. And it's still a case, even despite all this recent development happened, which we, read about. So we see here that in each decade, starting from 1950s, Pyongyang, there were a couple of residential areas which were constructed in Pyongyang. From decade to decade, the city was redeveloping. However, we need to put a special attention on the last decade, because when Kim Jong-un came to the power, it seems that he made focus on urban development and urban construction as a strategy to revitalize the whole economy of the country. And it all started with this glamorous high-rise streets of Mirequahakchakuri and Roman Street, right? In the 90s, in the middle of 90s, DPRK went through the so-called arduous march, right? And probably the most severe economic crisis in contemporary North Korean history. But this economic crisis made possible for market to emerge. And as we know, the market started to develop from Chanmadan. And we actually need to point, nobody point attention on that, but Chanmadan, they first emerged in the cities, right? So cities are always the places where we can fix the socio-economic development, contemporary, happening in the society. And so because the markets emerged and the market as an institution emerged, of course, there are some features. We will not discuss them because we don't have just time for that. And because of the market emerged, of course, also the strata, the people who were encouraged to make business, to do business, to earn money. Because of that, the special strata, which we call Tongju or Dongju, emerged. And they literally just a rich strata of people who dealing with business and try to earn money as everywhere in the world. However, because of the weak banking system and instability with local currency, and we know the examples how it worked in North Korea. So because of that, Tongju started to look where they could invest money to protect them, because it's not everybody who has money wants to invest them, right? Not to hide them under the pillow, but they want to have a profit. And so this logic works here as well. So what was happening? Tongju started to co-invest into the urban construction. And from the urban studies perspective, what we need to point out here, the two crucial moments. The first one is that it is easily to observe and to detect from the satellite images that in Pyongyang contemporary, we hear that the development in Pyongyang is held in the form of residential districts, right? Like Mirekwakakcha, Remount Street, but it's not true, because as you see on the picture on your left, there are many areas, it's just a picture of one of them. There are many areas in Pyongyang where we can detect infill development. So it's like single towers, single buildings around usually one-story area, That's why it's very important, because it means that it's not only residential districts where Tongju want to invest the money, but probably, and it's highly likely, that also they invest into the infill towers, because there is no other reason that the government will build a single building around one-story area in the different parts of Pyongyang, located actually close to transport stations, to objects of social infrastructure and other objects. So this is actually the subject I'm working on right now. And the second point we need to figure out is that the new residential districts, they are significant with a big number of service points. So what we can detect here is the commercialization of urban fabric. Because if you remember what we have seen before from Pyongyang, I mean the pictures of Pyongyang, it was kind of hard to detect any shop or for example, barber shop or anything, any place providing service. However, everything has been changed. These new residential districts, they look like consumption paradise, let's say, in the reality of Pyongyang, because you can find there not only like supermarkets or anything or grocery shops, but also places which kind of provide an exotic service like coffee shop, like barber shop, the place which, for example, selling this jelly beers or anything like very interesting places, pizza shop or anything like this. So how does it work? How Tongju invest into and how it became possible in the US socialist country for this kind of strata to Tongju to be able to invest into the construction and then make a profit from that. So the problem or the thing is that the state invest, of course, according to the law and according to the standards. All the construction, it's only supervised and held by the state. However, there is a crucial problem, because state as an institution cannot provide all the sources, all the financial sources, all the construction materials to finish this project. And this is the place for Tongju to offer a help. So this is a beneficial symbiosis between the state and Tongju, because state, by using this opportunity, they kind of glorify the regime, because they say, look what we can do. We can construct this kind of, enormous, magnificent residential complexes. From the other side, Tongju using this and making money because they invest and then get profit. Actually, the main part of all the apartments in newly constructed buildings, they go to Tongju in favor to the investments, not to the state allocation system. It's just very small number of apartments which go to like someone who stayed to give it for free. So, and this is a place for cooperation, mutual beneficial cooperation. In principle, let's check how it works. In principle, so there are three parties involved into the construction, any construction. This is the National Planning Commission, the organization Ordinary Construction, and construction companies. So the National Planning Commission is the main body responsible for all the constructions held in North Korea. So what they do, they actually establish all the construction plans, they supervise, they like review, they kind of like, it's kind of how to say, supervising body. Second is organizations ordering construction. And this is actually a very interesting thing because they supervise the construction process. Right. So they in touch with both the National Planning Committee because they need to, to communicate with them. And also they control construction companies which make the construction itself. So the organization ordering construction. The funny fact that is any company, a legal company, which is registered in North Korea can serve as organization ordering construction, even if this organization doesn't have anything common with construction. So actually, those who want to construct a building, for example, how it works, right? I just try to explain. They just find so-called umbrella companies which provide them a necessary like protection to show the government that, oh, here is a plan, here is a company, we want to initiate this construction. So literally, Tongju even don't need anything. I mean, to deal with any institutional, with any like government institutions. They just pay money for this organization who can serve them, can be their umbrella companies. And this is also kind of very funny, at least was for me. So, and we are coming to the golden age of Juche style architecture. Recently in Rodong Shinmun, there are so many articles related to so-called golden age of architecture. And of course, with focus to Pyongyang, because in 2021, Kim Jong-un offered a huge campaign to construct 50,000 apartments in Pyongyang during 5 years. And as we know, this process is like impressive because we see the clear results, right? Because it's all started in 2021, right? When this campaign was announced. And from that time, we see that in Pyongyang, there is a significant number of projects which are reported to be finished. It's not, and actually here's also a feature from the urban studies perspective, which we have to point out. So we know probably about this Honghua Street, Hwasong Street, actually Hwasong Street, they finished first and second stage, recently second stage, and there will be also the third stage. So it's now under the progress, and recently probably April or May. So Chongwi Street, right? And also we shouldn't forget that there was a Potonggang Riverside raised residential district. Why I put an attention on that project? Because Songhua, Hwasong, and Chongwi streets, they are typical, let's say, standard North Korean residential districts with high-rise towers. right? They just try to glorify the achievements of the regime. However, the Potong River terraced residential districts is different because it's not high-rise residential district. So it seems there are so many speculations in academic debates right now why North Koreans all of a sudden chose this kind of project. As per me, I think that North Koreans try to, because currently in urban studies, we have a strong opinion that the high-rise housing is not very good way to organize the housing. About what's going on currently in Pyongyang. Pyongyang is just one place, right, where this construction is happening. But it means that, to realize, to finish this kind of huge projects, we need at least construction materials, right? And if we don't produce them in enough, right? So then we just will not be able to finalize them. So that's why, actually, if you are what I'm doing right now also is the second part of my job, I'm trying to make a context analysis into all the articles published in Rodong Shimun started from 2021. And what I found out is that it is a significant growth of the articles mentioning that they increased the amount of cement or amount of steel production in different places. It's not only one place. So it's a numerous number of fabrics. And second is that they try to attempt to implement this new regional policy, which the essence of which is actually to revitalize the economy of the regions and to accelerate the rural development. And this is very surprising because previously rural areas, North Korean regime didn't mention them that often, at least as they do now. If you check the number and the amount of, the size of the articles now in Rodong Shimun, which dedicate to rural development, it's surprisingly growing, and they're discussing a variety of issues, which is also very interesting. Also, they try to construct social infrastructure places and many fabrics, industrial objects. So, and as we see, this urban development in Pyongyang not only support the development of Pyongyang itself, but because of that, the whole economy, the different layers, industrial, social development, intensification of production, not only construction materials, but as we see, there are so many new industrial objects like fabrics. And the strategy was quite successful because they not only accelerated urban development of Pyongyang, but they also pushed the national economy, and not only around Pyongyang, but in different places, in different regions of North Korea, to revitalize to some extent. We don't know the scale, but we see that something new is constructed, right? So that's why I think it's very important.
Thank you so much for very informative information on real estate, say, geography and then political geography of, then your research is fascinating, to many of us. I think but it's more, let's start with some, details. Can you elaborate or explain a little bit more about Jung district? You emphasize again and again, So, you said Gonju and then Nouveau Haitian, and they cannot get in this gated community of nomenclatura. And then they are actually the major force in the, say, new apartment complexes you suggested, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I think this is pretty interesting, social mixture, strata, the mixture, in this, new, apartment complex. But, we're quite curious. And then where does money come from? And then don't you say it's enormous, the capital you say, but I some money from outside to combine and invest in the Pyongyang's in a new apartment complex.
Actually, this is complicated, and we don't know the truth for 100% because it's just like. However, there are results of interviews made with not only defectors, but actually with North Koreans currently living in North Korea and who deal with business, different spheres, right? Where Tongju or those who deal with business can make big money. Mostly, it is the areas of, it's kind of like the sectors, the primary sector, let's say like this. So it's fishery. And actually, so many people who have money, they do something with fishery. I actually was surprised about that, but they sell it mostly to China, and that's where they get money from. Not only fishery, also I hear the stories about, you will be surprised, excavation of coal and other things. Also, some of them became rich by doing trade, being involved in trade with China. So they literally buy this cheap Chinese stuff and then try to resell it in local markets. It's also actually kind of beneficial from the financial perspective. Yeah, and recently what I heard, they kind of, all this fishery, extraction of natural resources, this is kind of beneficial. But what I have heard is that they told me that it's just not comparable with that profit they can get from real estate.
Real estate, I think it's the most, say, front line of the capitalist competition. I think it's just happening in South Korea. South Korea has a so-called, Seoul and Seoul's Gangnam area. But I think it's the Gangnam of Seoul, of South Korea, and then Junggu, and then new apartment complex of Pyongyang of North Korea. I think it's a too tricky, question to you. But do you see some similarities and distinctions between these two South Korean real estate in headquarters and then North Korean real estate headquarters in Pyongyang and in Seoul?
Actually, maybe Hwan Shin-tae 교수님 from Dongguk University. He actually called Junggu of Pyongyang, Junggu-guyok, as North Korean Gangnam.
Oh,
But yes, he published an article actually in Korean where he called it as Gangnam of Pyongyang. But the thing is that it's very different, let's say, because Chunggu, as I told you, is mainly preserved from the urban development, right? They have some development projects, but it's like not in the center of Chunggu. While Gangnam is literally, it used to be field, right? Like
right.
50 years ago. And now it's like enormously expensive residential and commercial area, business district. And Pyongyang is different. It's just very different because the level of capitalism development is very different in two countries. So in Pyongyang, we say that they have market. A market is emerged and is developing, right? But it's still uncomparable with those we have in other countries of Asia. Because in South Korea is, I think, very capitalist oriented country, right? It's nothing bad with that. It's just another way. So that's why I think, no, I cannot compare them. I think they are very different. However, I think if North Korea will become a really, like, not pseudo, not semi-market economy, of course, the market forces will shake these walls. And the gated community just cannot exist in a free market economy. Okay.
Thank you for your excellent and very informative presentation, and then very say another information round of discussion with me. Good to have you and happy to have you. Hope we can see you soon and then have more working and collaboration relationship. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, and have a great day.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, Professor Justin Hastings, and we are going to discuss about the current economic approach of the DPRK North Korea to international community today. And Justin Hastings, Professor Hastings is a well-renowned, world-renowned scholar on the North Korean politics and other international relations and comparative politics in issues. All right. Again, thanks for joining us, Professor Justin Hastings, and then the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. So they asked me to speak about the current economic approach of the DPRK to the international community. And what I'm going to speak about are basically two projects that are related to North Korea and how it participates in markets. One is sort of how North Korea uses markets to evade sanctions. First, and the second is how North Koreans use markets to build social trust. There is something tying these together. So the first question they asked me to answer was what methods and with which entities has North Korea employed to circumvent economic sanctions? And I think the general broad answer is North Korea is able to evade economic sanctions because it is entrepreneurial, right? This is a North Korean restaurant in Shenyang in China that I visited many years ago. And North Korea is out of the arduous march. North Korea developed an entrepreneurial culture that is comfortable basically engaging in lots and lots of different activities related to the markets. So what we see here is a number of different proliferation evasion strategies. Sort of all of these strategies, in some sense, are used by North Korea in various permutations to get what it wants. It uses state resources. It uses sort of obfuscation. It hides the identity of the people and the goods and the firms involved in transactions. It tries to structure its networks in a way that looks like it's a legitimate network, even though they're evading sanctions. It chooses which countries to do business with based on the gap between what the countries can do in terms of trade and what the countries are willing or able to do in terms of enforcement. And finally, North Korea just engages in a lot of good old-fashioned smuggling, sort of between North Korea and the countries around it. And the way in which it does this is by engaging in trade, right? So people have often asked me, how does North Korea actually evade sanctions, especially sanctions that are designed to sort of identify North Koreans who are participating in the system? And the answer is they don't. They have someone else do it for them, right? I mean, that's the basic key, right? North Korea is embedded in global networks in a way that I think many people would be surprised to see. Sort of they are embedded in a series of brokerage systems or brokerage networks outside of North Korea that essentially mean that anytime a sort of buyer or seller is doing business with someone, they don't actually know they're doing business with North Korea, right? Because there's someone doing business on North Korea's behalf, either to buy it or sell it or move the goods or to make connections. And what this essentially means is North Korea is evading sanctions by being very good at sort of building connections around the world. So one of the ways they do this is by ship-to-ship transfers. So if we think about all the different ways in which North Korea evades sanctions, one of the things they do is engage in sort of transfers of oil and coal at sea as a way of getting around the sanctions that sort of are designed to stop them from using foreign ports and using North Korean flagged vessels. And so, in some sense, this is already showing how North Korea is using other countries as a way of evading sanctions. So we can see sort of diagrams. These are complicated. I'm not going to go over them in great detail of how North Korea works as a buyer country, how it works as a seller country, and how it works as a broker country. Right. And so we can see here in a typical ship-to-ship transfer where North Korea wanted to buy oil, they are heavily involved in a number of different countries and a number of different brokers doing business for them. And so we can see here is that North Korea wants to buy some oil. It's actually sort of a Hong Kong-based sort of brokerage that is the one that buys the oil from an international company based in Singapore and Switzerland. And the international company transports the oil on a Marshall Islands registered ship that's actually owned by a series of Taiwanese front companies. We're doing business on behalf of North Korea. There's an actual North Korean ship coming out and getting the oil, but the front companies are actually told the buyer that they are shipping oil from South Korea to Taiwan. In fact, they sort of met in the sort of south of South Korea and transferred the oil to a North Korean ship. So we see here that North Korea, in some sense, is only involved in receiving the oil, but they had a lot of people doing all the work for them in acquiring the oil to buy. We also see North Korea as a supplier country, right? Here is North Korea selling goods to Syria. We see that North Korean state-owned companies, state prerogatives, are in fact being used, both through the North Korean embassy in Damascus as a broker, as well as the original seller, which is Comid, the main North Korean state weapons company. All right, and so what we see here is that, again, there's a number of North Korean connections, but a lot of the business is being done by other people, by companies in China that are actually shipping the goods, by front companies in Syria that are receiving the goods on behalf of the Syrian government, through a series of other front companies, and by North Korean offices, both in China and in North Korea, that are operating on behalf of Comid. And finally, the interesting thing about North Korea is that because it has engaged in a lot of buying and a lot of selling as a way of evading sanctions, this actually makes it really good at brokering as well, because it has both, right? And brokering for North Korea is actually a lot less problematic than buying or selling, because North Korea never has to touch the goods, right? It doesn't have to enter North Korea. They don't have to leave North Korea. North Korea can make money and pursue its geopolitical aims simply by making sure that the buyer gets the goods from the seller, right? And in this case, this is an arms-related shipment to Syria, about 10 years ago. And what we see is that Syria, through its front companies, wanted to buy a series of weapons that were produced by companies in countries like Taiwan, Hong Kong, the US, Denmark, countries that don't necessarily want to sell weapons to Syria, right? And so what did they do? They approached ultimately a North Korean state-owned companies who, through their companies, it's a series of front companies owned by Chinese nationals. So here's third country nationals operating on behalf of North Korea, then engaged in procurement for these supplier companies through Hong Kong and China, had the goods shipped to China, and then onward shipped to Syria. So from the perspective of the supplier companies, it looked as if they had never actually bought any goods or sent any goods to Syria. They were selling them to China. Finally, I think North Korea, we're asking, well, how does North Korea actually get goods into or out of the country? They make extensive use of smuggling. They have 3 smuggling routes: by land, by river, or by sea, that both state-owned companies in North Korea and non-state companies can use, right? And so one of the things to keep in mind is that while North Korea does actually have a substantial state involvement in a lot of its trade, a lot of the trade is actually done by people who are theoretically state-owned companies, but are actually fundamentally private, right? And that leads to the second issue. What factors have contributed to the emergence of social trust in the context of daily political interactions, right? And I think what we can see here, this is based on a project I did with a number of other people on the connection between North Korean market participation and potential building blocks for civil society in North Korea. We asked a number of North Korean defectors on living in South Korea, well, what was their experience participating in markets, and what did they learn from that? And we came up with a basic framework which says, look, North Korea has a number of political and economic challenges in it. These challenges lead to a set of challenges that North Koreans face in participating in the market, including social trust is low, uncertainty is high, information is hard to acquire, and obviously enforcement of contracts is difficult. This leads in turn to a series of market participation strategies. And key to our argument is that by engaging in these market participation strategies, North Koreans, perhaps inadvertently, sometimes on purpose, build social trust. They build reciprocity and trust networks, right? They essentially build the building blocks of civil society through market participation and the way in which they participate in markets. So we can go through and think about what these strategies are and what they actually result in. So the first thing is that North Koreans build networks. Right, these networks are often have state officials involved, both as partners, as providing political cover, as providing information for the markets, and engaged in goods buying and selling themselves. But North Koreans also use a number of personal connections, non-official, non-business connections, to build these networks, and these networks are often the basis of North Korean business. North Koreans also rely on a number of personal interactions, both in terms of negative market reinforcing interactions. Obviously, the threat of retaliation can be high. Vulnerability, mutual vulnerability can be very high in a semi-legal environment like this, as well as positive market reinforcing interactions. The reciprocity, repeated interactions lead to greater trust. Expanding your networks, buying and selling and sharing knowledge is all useful for basically building trust in business relationships in North Korea. We also found that there's a good deal of transnational influence in North Korean markets as well, right? Partly this is because many North Koreans did in fact work abroad or have money from abroad to start up their businesses. They have startup capital from these. They have a number of Chinese connections, which can be used not only for business, but also for other purposes. And this is critical and I think kind of interesting. It's also the case that business, because it's in some sense not particularly sensitive in North Korea, it can provide a reason for why North Koreans have transnational ties, right? It was often the case that business served as a cover for transnational ties, mostly to China, that allowed North Koreans to bring in information or engage in sensitive activities. Right? And this is true even if there were state officials involved in the networks. More specifically related to the results of market participation, we see that sort of North Koreans, generally it is a sort of low trust society, but participating in markets, particularly over the long term, did allow North Korean respondents to build a reputation, and thus they built social capital. Right? It was specifically market participation that allowed them to build these connections and accumulate social capital. And in some sense, what we found is that social trust was necessary to run a business successfully, right? So as they were sort of thinking about how to build businesses, even sort of businesses that they were sort of built on relationships, they realized that they actually had to have large degrees of trust and reciprocity in those relationships. And what this meant, and I think sort of what we see here then, is that if they wanted to participate in markets, they often required a continuous flow of information. Now remember, information is often very hard to come by in North Korea. So how do you get it? Right? You get it by a sort of virtuous cycle of having greater social capital, which allows you to share and receive information, right? And this sort of social capital also allows you to help other people, which in turn allows you to get more social capital and also to build market connections and build sort of information that you can use for acquiring more business. And what this means in some sense is that access to information is both a cause and effect of social capital, and social capital is both a cause and effect of success in business. Right? And so what we saw in general is that the more social trust North Koreans had, the more social capital they had, the more successful they were in business. And you can see an example of this, sort of one quote, I'm not going to read it, but sort of the quote starts off with the idea that North Korea is a low trust society, right? The first and foremost rule of business is to trust no one. And obviously that's sort of the general stereotype about North Korea. But by the end, the quote says, at least some trust is needed and should be built over time. Right? So North Korea's low trust, but you actually need trust to survive. You need trust to do business well in North Korea, right? And the question of how you do that, and how you build trust is very important for North Koreans. One of the things that they're able to do as a result of participating in markets is essentially building shared norms and understandings. And shared norms can come from three different, I think, very interesting sort of aspects of North Korean market participation. The first, and this is probably the most surprising, market information is not politically sensitive. Right? It's okay to talk about how to make money in North Korea. It's okay to talk about business. And so in some sense, market information is one of the few kinds of information that is shared widely, right? Which leads to a shared norm of information sharing, right? Competition itself can drive people to adopt shared understandings about how much they're willing to sell for, right? And sort of buyers and sellers will monitor the prices so that they stay within acceptable ranges. Right? And finally, the fact that sort of all these market activities are not sensitive but still borderline illegal in North Korea means that in some sense, there's a shared norm of maximizing survival rather than maximizing price, right? If you maximize price, you might sort of minimize your chances of survival, right? And so in that sense, maximizing profits is not the goal of North Korean business over the long term. It's maximizing networks that allow you to keep doing business. And finally, we see that sort of these sort of, as North Koreans build these networks and as they do business, we see that these are in fact building trust networks. Right? Sort of the trust networks themselves are created as a win-win for all participants. Obviously, sort of as North Koreans do business with each other on a repeated basis, repeated interactions incrementally lead to higher levels of trust. And so the trust networks themselves become more successful. And finally, sort of the shared interest people have within North Korea, not only in making money and trading goods, but also the fact that they're often in the same industry in the same region, as well as, I think, interestingly, the fact that they need to deal with the state collectively to protect their own interests. Which we saw sort of the beginnings of sort of collective action in North Korea as a result, comes through sort of trust networks built on these shared interests. So that's all I have. So thanks very much.
Thank you for your excellent and very succinct presentation, which contains a lot of materials. I would love to listen more on your the lecture item. Yeah, I mean it's interesting the contents at the same time. North Korea as a buyer country, and then supplier and seller countries, and then broker country, and then this diagram actually fascinating I think it's based upon your research and the published material. I think it's 2017, 18 or something like that. That's great. Yeah, I mean, and then again, just let us know, who are for this in North Korea as a trade, and who are the primary stakeholders? And then, what are the roles of foreign entities? And you actually suggested, just give us China, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and then Switzerland. There are many countries, and then the players of those countries actually involved in this trade with North Korea. Who are the most important and then critical, should not be missing type of player in here?
So, I think if you're talking about who are the North Korean players, for example, right? Sort of the North Korean players, sort of the farther you get from North Korea, the more likely it is that it's the state-owned companies and sort of directed sort of by the central government that are involved in this, right? The closer you get to North Korea, the more likely it is that there are functionally non-state companies involved in trade across the China-North Korea border, right? And so a lot of the trade that happens between China and North Korea before COVID and now increasingly since COVID is actually done by companies and by individuals that are paying off the state, or it might be sort of like state clients, but are not necessarily actually directly directed by the state, right? In terms of the foreign stakeholders, sort of the people that North Korea does business with, again, it sort of depends on sort of whether you're a buyer or a seller and sort of what you want from North Korea. If you're a seller, North Korea is the companies that are selling to North Korea indirectly often don't know they're selling to North Korea, right? That's what North Korea's sanctions evasion strategy is designed to do, right? And so, those companies are just regular companies, right? Regular companies in the US, regular companies in Europe, regular companies in Japan, and sort of they produce things that North Korea wants. Sort of the entities that are actually doing business directly with North Korea and know that they're doing business directly with North Korea are generally going to be somewhat smaller companies who are in the region, in sort of East Asia. So companies in Taiwan, companies in Hong Kong, in China, and companies in Singapore, although Singapore has significantly cracked down on it recently. And these are the companies that are doing business. They know they're doing business with North Korea. They are the ones that essentially serve as the front companies for North Korea, but they're not actually owned by North Koreans. Right? Generally, they're fairly small. Even the state of North Korea, the quantities of goods it wants are actually not huge. And so it's things that smaller companies can facilitate.
Smaller companies actually can participate and facilitate. And I think it's the interest, the margin of interest and profits is pretty small in many senses. And in comparison with, other, trading big giants in other parts of the world. But, it makes money. So they can.
Yeah, it makes money. I think sort of, if you look at sort of the companies that are involved, sometimes, and I did this in my own research when I talked to sort of Chinese traders and that did business with North Korea. For them, it's not necessarily the matter of huge profits. It's the matter of sort of lack of better options. Right? And then once you have the connection with North Korea and it works, then it's sort of a relatively consistent profit, which is not necessarily huge. If you're in northeastern China, you don't necessarily have a lot of other options when it comes to trade. So that's sort of the problem that they face, but also the advantage that North Korea has.
And then, my last question, how do you predict this evolutionary, path of this informal social trust building in the North Korean economy or North Korean society in general? Is it going to be a more, say, critical, variable for, North Korean political system or economic system and social system? And then might be already we see, many, the constraints and restraints by, regime itself. But, how do you see this evolutionary path of social trust building in the North Korean business world?
So, I think COVID obviously threw North Korea for a loop. We'll see sort of what emerges on the other side in terms of what the markets look like. But, one thing to keep in mind, and this is the project, how we approach the project, is that we don't pretend that this is going to change North Korea overnight. We think of this more as the basis, markets providing the basis for at least some elements of civil society if and when there's a change from the top, right? What that is, we can't predict. Whether that's some exogenous sort of shock, whether that's some change, from above inside North Korea, we don't know. But we say, well, the point of markets and the result of markets is that they're providing at least some sort of green shoots that could be used if and when North Korea does actually change and open up, right?
Okay.
So there is some basis for trust there in what you would generally think of as a very low trust society.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for your lecture, and then I'm very interesting in myself. I really enjoy the enjoyable conversation, Q&A session lasting 20 minutes. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us and to give a fascinating the lecture on this fish and then dining politics of North Korea. And this is the very distinguished scholar, Professor Robert Winstanley-Chesters from UK. And we are going to have 15 minutes of lecture and then 15 to 20 minutes discussion between Professor Winstanley-Chesters and me. Okay, so the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to seeing to your lecture.
First of all, thank you very much for having me. So yes, I am Robert Winstanley-Chesters from the University of Edinburgh, and the reason why I'm talking about this this topic is essentially because it's the result of many years of work on fishing geography and fishing communities in North Korea. I'm a geographer by trade and by discipline, and my PhD is in human geography, which is why I am focusing on this. And I spent a lot of time working on North Korean fishing geographies and fishing communities a long way away from Pyongyang. And one thing that people always ask me about fishing in North Korea is, where do the fish go? Do North Koreans eat fish? And to a degree, yes, but primarily a lot of the product produced by the fishing communities of North Korea and the fishing infrastructure of North Korea is focused on elite dining in Pyongyang and servicing the sort of food needs of the sort of citizens of Pyongyang and the government and the elites of North Korea. So that's why I have ended up looking at this for this particular topic. So Andrew Lankoff, along with a number of others, the famous scholar from Keimyung University, I think, has previously written about eating in North Korea, and a few others have as well. Lankoff says Koreans love eating out, as every long-term resident of Seoul knows from his or her own experience. Going to a restaurant is one of the most common leisure activities in Korea. In this regard, the North is not that much different. So traditionally, Korean food output and restaurants known the sort of Ogurwang, and its earlier restaurant, the Ogurwang is the earlier one, and Chogurwang is the newer one. In contemporary North Korean politics and the sort of connections around the world, restaurants that North Korea is famous for, primarily outside of North Korea, for the connections that North Korea makes elsewhere through the Arirang chain, the Pyongyang Arirang chain, these North Korean restaurants that you find across Asia. I recommend in particular the branch in Kathmandu, in Nepal, which is a fine restaurant, where North Korea uses these restaurants to sort of extract value from the various countries and to support its embassies in those countries. It's also famous for the development of street food, which I'll talk a bit more later. But traditionally, the elite restaurants are the most important. And Ogurwang opened in 1960 on the Taedong River. A very large restaurant, sits up to 2,000. Built in a very traditional Korean style. It's supposed to be, it's regarded as a type of living museum by North Korea. So South Korea often talks about intangible cultural heritage. So this is a sort of intangible cultural heritage for North Korea, and is the custodian of Pyongyang cold noodle soup. So it's the most famous restaurant to sell cold noodle soup. It was very difficult historically to actually get a seat and a table at Ogurwang. You had to have a ticket, which you had to obtain through your work unit or through a political connection. And the tickets were only to gain entry, so they didn't pay for your food. So diners had to pay extra for food and drink. And obviously that was very expensive for North Korea. And so North Koreans only rarely had access to these restaurants, even the more recently Chongkwang restaurant. But by 2009, at the end of Kim Jong-il's rule, these restaurants were not the only places where elites could eat in Pyongyang. There had been a series of not just the pochong matcha style, not just the sort of these pochangmacha street food dining style stalls. And I know in South Korea, pochangmacha are very often in sort of tents on the street. But in North Korea, they tend to be in these sort of like food stalls that are built into the urban architecture. But also junk food, or what we might consider in the UK, Europe, or the United States, junk food style restaurants. So there was a Singaporean group who brought the franchise for a US a company called Waffle Town to North Korea, and they opened up the first KFC style fried chicken restaurant in North Korea, Samtaesong, 3 big stars. Now 3 big stars is owned by the aunt of Kim Jong-un, Kim Kyung-hui, and it has over 30 different outlets across North Korea. And so also there's a variety of other things like pasta and pizza restaurants and burger restaurants. And these sort of serve a new elite of North Korea under the rule of Kim Jong-un, the elite that have been talked about as donju, or masters of money. Those people who have been able to navigate the financial crises and challenges of the recent decades to accumulate a degree of wealth and saving through sort of extracting rents and fees, through trading in Jangwadang markets and trading and exchanging across the Chinese border and reinvesting funds with the Chinese investors in apartment building complex. So Pyongyang's built so many apartments, it's now sometimes jokingly referred to as Pyonghattan. And so as much as these new North Korean elites desire burgers, tteokbokki, or pizza, they also occasionally want something more formal and luxurious. So joining the older style elite restaurants on the riverside of Pyongyang in recent years has been this brand new elite restaurant, the Taedonggang. And so the opened in 2018 and very quickly blessed, as I say, by a visit from Kim Jong-un. The Taedonggang is the height of North Korean luxury dining. It's a collection of spaces essentially dedicated to the eating of fish. It has a Korean specialities restaurant, a sushi restaurant, and a restaurant dedicated to European fish dishes, all on the second floor. But primarily below, on the ground floor in this restaurant, is a large pool, a large sort of a large fish pool filled with sturgeon, very large sturgeon. These are Chinese sturgeon. They're accompanied by a series of other pools containing different species of fish, crabs, terrapin, and other seafood. And it's sort of similar to other sort of elite restaurants around the world, particularly a restaurant chain called Zhao, which came from Tokyo originally, including has a branch now in New York City. Diners at the Taedonggang can catch their own fish in this ground floor pool with nets to take away or to have cooked on the premises. And so, it's a very charismatic space visited by Kim Jong-un, and important to Kim Jong-un, so much so that when Moon Jae-in visited Pyongyang in September 2018, Kim Jong-un picked this restaurant as the site of the dinner, the final dinner. So it's very expensive as a dining option, and way too expensive for the vast majority of North Koreans, but not beyond the means of wealthy citizens of Pyongyang looking for a treat, or beyond the means of party or army or government VIPs seeking to wine and dine their senior colleagues or commemorate a particularly important event. I should say also that there's a couple of photos in here which are from the fieldwork of a colleague of mine, Manon Prudhomme at the IHES University in Paris. Who's eaten there a few times, yeah. So Kim Jong-un obviously visited. Kim Jong-un took Moon Jae-in there. It's an important site for the elites of Pyongyang. But it's also interesting to me for the fact that the key dish at the Taedonggang is quite rare environmentally, which is the Chinese sturgeon. So one diner at the Taedonggang was remembered this when they were interviewed, that this was sturgeon they were eating. And Chinese sturgeon are critically endangered in the wild because of the various hydroelectric developments on the Yangtze River, which restricts their migration. It's bizarre that North Korea should use this particular species to serve the Taedonggang River. But when it becomes specifically, because it's very hard to get them, so they need to breed them and breed them through aquaculture projects, and they're also difficult to breed. So figure out technologically and sort of in animal husbandry ways the ways to best breed them to generate enough population so that you can actually use them as fish in a restaurant. But North Korea has been trying to do this since 2010. In fact, Kim Jong-il made a visit before he died in 2010 to the main breeding site at the Rongjong fish breeding farm, where he celebrated the success of the facility in breeding sturgeon in saltier water than they would normally live in, because these are not saltwater sturgeon, these are freshwater sturgeon. And the Taedonggang has continued to receive the fish directly from fishery research stations and the aquaculture facilities of these research stations around North Korea. So Taedonggang receives its Atlantic salmon because it doesn't just serve sturgeon, it also serves Atlantic salmon, and it gets these Atlantic salmon from the Raksan offshore salmon farm, and so and there are a number of other salmon farms. Taedonggang is therefore considered very much part of the environmental and scientific development of North Korea. However, intriguingly, for a higher-end restaurant, diners have also recounted another unusual aspect of eating at the restaurant, other than the fact that they're eating sturgeon. And that's the fact that the food tastes like chlorine because the fish stay in a little pool for months and the fish tastes like chlorine, according to one interviewer. And this perhaps reminds the reader not just of the ecological impact of eating the fish for this restaurant directed at North Korea's elite, but the fact that in spite of the various developmental efforts and real developmental efforts over several decades involved in the breeding and production of fish and sturgeon like this, it reminds us of the logistical issues involved in food supply, including the preparation and the conservation of those fish once caught, and the sort of hygiene standards in the preparation facilities and distribution in North Korea. But it's fascinating to see that even in a venue meant for the elite and meant for the consumption of highly valuable and ecologically sensitive food, this is still the case, despite the ambitions of North Korea, of Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il. I want to say one more aspect in these 15 minutes about the sort of developmental ambitions of North Korea at the sea or related to the sea. And that is the developments at Wonsan Kalma. So this is essentially a story prior to COVID-19. The investment stopped because COVID-19 essentially closed North Korea since 2020. But prior to COVID-19, a huge amount of investment was to support the infrastructure and the transformation of the Wonsan Kalma coast into a leisure destination for foreigners, essentially. So Wonsan was always important to North Korea, going back to 2006, famous for its Songdo-won beach and the Children's Union camp that was there, which brought children from across the communist world to North Korea. But in 2014, a special tourist zone was announced. And in 2016, the Wonsan Kalma tourist area was announced. And Kim Jong-un began to make a number of on-the-spot visits. Wonsan Kalma Airport had been redeveloped into a sort of international airport. And the Wonsan Kalma beach, which was famous from photos like this taken by the Singaporean Amanpa, ended up being redeveloped into this tourist site. So Kim Jong-un and a number of other premiers of North Korea and many other political figures visited this site and the developments between in 2017 and 2018, 2019, developing the site very rapidly, including a really wide variety of hotel accommodation and leisure options, including high-end hotels, but also things like family-sized villas and other sort of like cheaper apartments in the facilities, which Kim Jong-un was very interested. And while some speculated that Wonsan and its airport redevelopment focused on enabling South Korean tourists at the time to more easily reach Mount Kumgang, others suggested that actually it's Chinese tourists that North Korea was seeking with this development. So, Wonsan Kalma, we should perhaps consider before COVID to be North Korea's aspiration to create a mass market package holiday or budget tourist destination. And that Kim Jong-un was envisaging a sort of cheaper option for newly mobile Chinese citizens for whom getting into North Korea is much easier and cheaper than for Japanese or tourists from other nations.
Okay, so I have some questions, and then you actually the start with your the lecture with the where do fishes go? It's your basic argument is just to elites. Elites means probably say handful of probably 20,000 to 100,000 political elites in Pyongyang, and then not to ordinary citizens, and then those extraordinary, and then sometimes look very foreign. What are the primary information source for the food? They must know about this burgers and all kinds of say junk food. At the same time, this caviar and then other very extraordinary say foreign fishes too. So where do they get those information?
I mean, so North Korean elites historically, before the 1980s and 90s, did not travel abroad that often. But in recent decades, maybe they could hope to go abroad once in their life to China or to Vietnam. But in recent decades, North Korean political elites and sort of people in the donju, the sort of money-earning classes, have become much more mobile, apart from the COVID period. So people would travel a lot into China and other places in Asia, to Vietnam, to Myanmar, to other places. And in those journeys would become familiar with like luxury eating styles in other countries. And I think anybody who's ever been to China knows that one thing that Chinese people like to do is host. And when they take you to a restaurant, it's often the most luxurious restaurant they can afford. And they order all sorts of things which are very expensive. So like, as an act of hosting. So North Koreans themselves would have been involved in this, and they would have visited restaurants. Chinese fish-focused restaurants are always fascinating for the fact that you have to walk in through an enormous wall of aquariums with all of the different sort of fish, And yeah, so also I'm sure Jeonju, sort of younger North Korean elites would have become familiar with luxury dining and food styles of the rest of the world through the sort of media information they receive from South Korea in various ways on the sort of USB sticks smuggled in, that sort of stuff. And so North Korean elites and younger North Koreans are aware of these luxury foods. And, a certain level of luxury dining has always been present in Pyongyang for the very high elite, even in the 60s and 70s, because Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il were always very interested in food, interested in like fine dining. Kim Jong-il apparently loved pizza so much that he flew a team of chefs from Naples to open up the first pizza restaurant and to train a group of army officers into how to cook pizza. Yeah. And so if you go to Pyongyang and you go to the earliest Italian restaurant, it's actually very good.
Thank you for your excellent lecture, and then the fascinating conversation on the fish business and fish restaurant business in Pyongyang and North Korea. And it was very informative, and then it was very fun. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Sohee, thanks to you, and thanks to Yonsei for having me, and the Ministry of Unification.
Thank you so much. Okay, this is the end. Today, we invited, Professor Adam Cathcart, Associate Professor of East Asian History of University of Leeds. He is a very well-known scholar, who is working on border politics, mainly North Korea and China and North Korea, and then, of course, in Vietnam and Mongolia and other, Asian countries. Okay, Professor Cathcart, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Peck. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to your questions and the kind of productive discussion around this very interesting topic, which I was asked to speak to. The title of the presentation is meant to provoke just slightly because, of course, we have legal and illegal trade happening at the same time. And this concept of porousness or exchange is one where is really the question is open. How open is the border for both legal and illegal trade? And then, of course, what impact does that have within North Korea? And how do the Chinese side police this? And kind of to what extent is China enabling or preventing more illegal trade or smuggling in particular into North Korea. So I'll start my slides here. Just a few resources. This is my most recent book, co-edited with colleagues at Leiden University, and Christopher Green is a well-known translator and scholar of North Korea. And he was previously at Daly K, then he went to Cambridge University. He's now an assistant professor at Leiden University and previously worked with International Crisis Group. So Stephen Denny, a political scientist. And the work, which I will refer to at probably near the very end, is just listed here at the bottom, how authoritarian regimes maintain domain consensus, kind of thinking a little bit about and trying to problematize this slightly binary opposition we tend to have between markets and authoritarian regimes or Leninist party states like North Korea. So trying to think about what are ways in which the regime is co-opting some of those ostensibly anti-regime or potentially problematic, both ideologically and logistically, elements like Donju or marketized individuals, right? Individuals benefiting. And of course, North Korean quote-unquote reform looks very different than China, and also their type of anti-corruption and definitions of corruption. So those are some ideas which I wish to look at in this presentation. I also am the editor of the sinonk.com website, which has a good archive and continues to look at interactions between the two. And Professor Peck mentioned Mongolia. Some of our writers on that site are looking at kind of Korea-Mongolia ties and trying to broaden out a little bit this North Korean relationship, including with Russia. But we don't want to get too fixated on Russia, and I won't be mentioning much about it today. Okay, so Chinese smuggled goods in North Korean markets. Of course, this deals at the local level in North Korea with at the gun level or county level, and we discuss domestic controls and the role of small trade. That, of course, operates under the umbrella of larger scale legal trade between the two states, and in some sense is dependent upon decent relations, a good working relationship between the Korean Workers' Party, Nodongdang, and the Chinese Communist Party, or Jungkook Gongchandang. So this kind of and the policing of illegal trade is also dependent on those interactions. So the kind of the image, by the way, in the lower left of your screen is of gun officials in county level officials in Pyongyang who came to be instructed by the leader Kim Jong-un in April 2021. And of course, in the upper left there is the very famous bridge, which is not really a bridge anymore, between Dandong and Sinŭiju. The effectiveness of controls in the border region, this is a short presentation, so I am not going to necessarily be drawing massive distinctions between Yanbian, the Korean Autonomous Prefecture, or Dandong and Liaoning, but there are differences, and there are important differences. So I'm going to kind of touch on that just ever so slightly, the gradations of change. To focus on the Chinese side first, and most significantly, you have the Public Security Bureau. These are some images which I took a few years ago in Yenji in the upper left, Tumen, which is of course an important hub, much smaller than Dandong, but an important cross-border trade that right across from Wonsan County in Hamgyong-bukdo or North Hamgyong province. But in some sense, this image in the lower left indicates, in a sense, kind of how fragmentary or how kind of residual sometimes these border controls are. This is an advertisement for a two-man city public security bureau aid station or a working group kind of to patrol the border. And it's rather faded. And in fact, some of the infrastructure there is in flux, right? This question of kind of how strong and how strenuous are the border controls. And of course, the floods recently, which I will touch upon, in North Pyongan province, wash a lot of that away. So this notion of kind of like we see, and I'll just hold up a newspaper here. This is a German newspaper, Die Zeit, which is a weekly newspaper. And this is a big, long report. And Stadt zieht die Mauern hoch. It's all about North Korea putting up the walls. And this is a newspaper saying that basically nobody's moving across the border. The infrastructure is amazing. They've built all this up during the pandemic, and there's no there's very little illegal moving back and forth. But I think looking at the local level, that can never fully be the case. And in fact, this border infrastructure requires logistics and supply and continuous reinforcement, etc. And that's a big investment for North Korea. And even on the Chinese side, I think that it's all dependent on people, right? And these officials. So let's look at one just case study here, right? Chinese provincial PSB leadership. This is Public Security Bureau, otherwise known as Gong'anju. This is Wen Jingchun, otherwise known as Mun Kyung-jun, who is an ethnic Korean who is the head of Public Security Bureau in Yenji City for the last 3 years. So a rather significant person. He's ethnic Korean, as I mentioned. He's born in Hulong, so he's been involved at the local level with public security work since the mid-1990s. So this is a person who he's also fairly well educated, a degree in Korean translation. This is not something you often see with Chinese police, who so it's not simply that his ethnicity is Korean. He's vested in kind of in interpretation. But he's a person who's been dealing with cross-border crime in terms of Haeryong and the Musan city, rather, on the North Korean side for a very long time. And so he is certainly familiar he's been familiar particularly on economic crime. So this is a person with a focus in the mid-2000s, so the mid-2010s rather. So kind of, this is hard to read. Is this sort of all anti-corruption? Is he disrupting trade networks with North Korea? But there is certainly an interplay here. And it's these type of people who have risen in the Xi Jinping bureaucracy who can kind of speak the language of anti-corruption and talk about disrupting illegality. Obviously, these are things that any police officer or police administrator would do well to emphasize, but have been particularly successful in the Xi Jinping era in terms of their rise. It's interesting that his predecessor, also an ethnic Korean, Kim Kyung-il, was charged with crimes in his exact same job, head of Public Security Bureau in Yenji City, not the entire prefecture. So you've got an ethnic Korean in place there. He was charged with crimes of corruption in 2019, and as far as I know, is in prison at the moment. So it's, they put people in these important jobs, but those people are also often themselves involved in corruption. Incidentally, just as an aside, his boss, the head of Public Security Bureau for the entire Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture, is of course an ethnic Chinese, Duan Yujian. So anyway, interesting case study here. Just this is publicly available data. We can at least get some sense of who is enforcing these policies, what kind of background do they have, to what extent would they be aware of and engage with and understanding these local smuggling or corruption networks. Illicit commodities and trade. Again, on the Chinese side of the border, we can see, and this is true in North Korea too, a longer term and perpetual struggle between state imperatives and local producers or local traders. So the image you see here is illegally produced tobacco, 36 tons of it confiscated, presumably burned, in Wangqing, which is, of course, one of the most ethnically Korean counties on the side. It doesn't directly abut the DPRK or North Korea, but it's very important, and it's kind of this hinterland, so to speak, of the Yenji prefecture. It gets less attention than a place like Hunchun or Ta because it's not right on the river, nor is it particularly economically modernized to those areas. But there is also an anti-narcotics crackdown not in the Yanbian Korean area. And in fact, Mr. Moon, who we just saw in the previous slide, was just last month at a kind of an anti-drug day. NGO sort of trying to get more talking about local addicts and prevention of drug networks, illegal drug networks. We see more of that sort of thing in Dandong, where the illicit commodities. So let me speak to that for a moment. In fact, I'm going to just back up to this slide of looking at the bridge in Dandong, since what I'm saying is about Dandong now. I think we have to consider obviously some of these classic examples of illegal commodities, commodities that are illegal on both sides. We're not talking about somebody moving rice, for example, as we as we saw like in Unsung County not too long ago, where you have local cadre in the Workers' Party who are kind of slapped on the wrist or arrested or criticized for illegal importing of rice during the pandemic, for example. We're talking about illegal commodities moving across the border, like narcotics, like sanctioned goods as well, certain types of metals moving across the border. So I think in this context that I've raised, the kind of anti-corruption in China, I think it's important not to consider anti-corruption just a one-way ratchet. It isn't that Xi Jinping continues to press for anti-corruption measures and therefore he continues to clean up, or that there is no way for illegal activity to come back. So what do I mean here on the structural level? If we look at recent reporting from RFA, Radio Free Asia Korean, they reported that Ma Xiaohong, a female business leader in Liaoning province in Dandong, the head of Hongxiang, she's the CEO of the Hongxiang firm, famously was taken off the board. She's a kind of an important chess piece in Chinese-North Korean trade, and she was criticized, removed from her post in Liaoning in 2016. And this was in a kind of China cracking down on cross-border trade. This is one of the big players. She's a big fish in North Korea. She's got a lot of networks with Donju there. And so there's this sense that China has moved in and has used anti-corruption as a pretext to remove her from Chinese North. Now RFA Korean has reported she may be back in the mix and working with North Korea. And it's the thing that these individuals, including those who have been charged with corruption, are still assets for the Chinese regime. And if they want to increase trade with North Korea, you bring those people back into the fold. So the impact of state widening trade, and this is very much what we see in China now, in Jilin and in the Dandong side, where they are talking about, we've got to get the economy back up and running. It isn't just about tourism, it's about cross-border trade and not manufacturing. Now we may see more North Korean workers coming in because they want to get cross-border trade revived, anything they can do. Does that then create more toleration for illegal trade, right? So does the impetus to reinstate or to accelerate and reinvigorate trade between North Korea and China, does that leave more trade for illegality? It certainly, I think, leaves more room for local officials to be sensing which way the wind is moving, and this kind of the overall direction, or the mass line, as they think they used to call it, 中路线, right? The general line towards kind of, if the general line is toward cross-border trade, we can take more independent initiative. And of course, the whole history of North Korea-Chinese relations since 1949, you see a lot of kind of locality to locality interaction under the umbrella of a broad blessing from the ministries of foreign affairs. But the central government's important, but local government, these people have got to hit their targets. So there's this sense of kind of reinvigoration, and illegality can happen underneath that. Okay, so getting closer to some kind of provocative questions, which we might then discuss. Known unknowns. The impact of the recent floods in North Pyongan province, for example. I think there's a sense that border controls are very poor at the moment in that area because of this infrastructural damage. Clearly, the fences and things of that nature would have been wiped out by the flood. We've read a few reports that there's a kind of a sense that traders and illegal trade is going to be moving up the river, getting away from Dandong and Shinwiju. There is the Jian-Manpo interchange, which, again, as a historian, during the Korean War, that's much more important than Dandong. That's where all the Chinese troops moved into North Korea from. If you want, that's where in the past, when North Korea got the gigantic trucks in for mobile missile launching. They probably came in on the train tracks there. May have come in on ships. But the Jian-Manpo interchange is always quieter. It's less watched. You don't have like Han Korea reporters kind of hanging around, or Chosun Ilbo reporters generally watching that interchange. But what we've seen, at least in unofficial reports, things like the Daily NK, for example, is that this Linjiang Chunggang-gun, rather, in Jiagangdo is probably one of the interchanges where we might see more action. I've been to that part of the border, not recently, of course, but the river is not terribly wide. It's the kind of upper Yalu, basically. There is one distinction that's kind of interesting, just from a slightly little bit of inside baseball, I guess, distinction. Linjiang and Chunggang County are, of course, you're at the edge of Jiagang-do there. Whereas if you go a little further down the border towards the Hesan side, you're talking about Yanggang-do and the two counties of Kim Hyung-jik-gun and Kim Jong-suk-gun, named, of course, after the family members of the founder, Kim Il-sung. So again, that's a quieter area. There's less infrastructure. But if you're talking about small smuggling, small scale smuggling, you might see more action there. There's, of course, a history of logging kind of going across the border there, automobiles moving back and forth. And so you can have some smaller scale stuff going across there, although the bridges are fairly small. And I'm not sure about the Linjiao. It's Hesan and Changbai County where the bridges and the infrastructure is much more able to receive kind of large scale freight. The impact of perceived, let's see, state interaction I mentioned with anti-corruption and illegal trade. The impact of perceived, flows and changes in Sino-North Korean relations. Not a lot of time to get into that. If you want to do it in the Q&A, I'm happy to discuss it. There's been so much discussion about sort of North Korea and Russia, and has China gotten a little upset with seeing this kind of love fest, or at least this kind of, and also the Ukraine arms munitions. It's interesting to think about how that affects a place like Hunchun, which is so close to Russia as well. Happy to discuss kind of the broader trends in Sino-North Korean relations. But as I mentioned, I think the economic imperatives for PRC sometimes can trump even the political ones. So it's not like Xi Jinping and the local cadre. If you read those readouts of Liaoning Central Party Committee, Jilin Central Party Committee, Yanbian officials, Dandong mayors, Dandong vice party secretaries, of course, the discourse of border security is there, and crisis management and crisis prevention. And of course, China was not very involved at all in this in the flood response for North Korea. And I've got some studies ongoing of previous examples of that. But at the same time, I think all those people are being pressed. Expand the economy, get border trade moving if you can. And finally, I mentioned the disentangling of the cross-border legal trade, along with illegal trade in North Korea. And I think this is the difficult thing, is to try to get a sense of cross-border illegality with local illegality. So when China's doing a crackdown on heroin, for example, in Wangjing or in Hunchun or around Dandong, do we read that as this makes a permissive environment for trade, for illegal trade between North Korea? It's very hard to read it's very hard to read to what extent any of this is being exported or brought in. So all you can do is read as much data as possible about the public security situation on the Chinese side of the border, and then and about where, in which salient to the border this is happening, and we can then perhaps infer more about what the situation might be like for a North Korean. And I'll just end with these images I took in South Pyongan province in 2016. So these are rather dated, but I think most people's firsthand experience of being in North Korea, those of us who have had the chance to be there, everybody's passport's getting a little bit dusty going to North Korea. So I hope to be back at some point in the near future. But these are some images I took in the last 8 years. And this is just a trip, as I mentioned, in South Pyongan, went to Pyeongseong. To this sort of sense of how easy is it to move around province to province, county to county. That's an open question, and probably a question for more scholars to approach. But I'll just put in one final plug for my paper on domain consensus, thinking about to what extent are local officials actually kind of involved in this and able to benefit from it. The many incentives on the North Korean side, amid the anti-corruption, amid the controls, are very similar to those on the Chinese side. That is all. Thank you very much. I'm ready to take some questions.
Yeah, and then my last question before let you go is, let's be a little bit more hypothetical. I mean, we know the sanction it's going to be there at least for a while, if not forever. And then sanctions lifted, and then the relationship between the North Korea and then the United States become better, and then South Korea also fine, and this border trade become legalized, and then they don't need to smuggle anymore. Then what's happened to this borderline political economy?
That's a brilliant question. I love it. I wish I had thought of that for my previous. That would be an amazing final chapter. And it might happen, right? There are many things that might move, right? I mean, you get suddenly North Korea is not, the Ukraine war ends, and so their Russian relationship is improved even further. They've got more help at the Security Council. And somehow, the Sino-North Korean relationship rebalances again. He and Xi Jinping kind of get back together. And the sanctions regime, I mean, we saw the UN panel of experts, right? Just whoosh, it's gone. I mean, amazing, right? The amount of research they were doing, those reports are you can read those for a whole year at a time, right? And so what if we have that kind of reconfiguring of trade? I guess the question is, do the small scale traders, are they able then to become legal, right? So we have to kind of look at questions of rule of law and management in North Korea and in China on both sides. This is the weird thing. We see this with the North Korean-U.S. negotiations. You remember the Trump era, of course, and where suddenly North Korea and China saying, "Wait a minute, this is, we need to feel in control here. We need to, you need to talk to us more as well." So we might have a hypothetical where the North Koreans actually want to open up the border more and want to see, Kim Jong-un has that beautiful, architectures, right? He loves the young architects, or at one time he gave a lot of praise to the young architects in Pyongyang. He's got a lot of plans for Shinwiju. And it might say, I'm ready to go again. But of course, the North Koreans are notorious for doing that very quickly, as in the case of 2000, 2001, 2002, right, where they had sort of the new economic zone for Shinwiju and had not really spoken to the Chinese about it. Yang Bin being the famous example of a Chinese capitalist who is ready to dive in with both feet. The Chinese state said, I'm sorry, your taxes are not in order. So I think, anyway, the very short answer to your question would be, in that counterfactual, watch out for China pumping the brakes and saying, wait a minute, we need to make sure this is all in order. Although I think in the long term they would benefit too, certainly, from sanctions being released.
This is going to be pretty interesting, and of course, narcotics cannot be legalized in the the borderline. But I think than that, it's going to be pretty interesting, and then I think it's pretty good for the China's northeast the part region, Dongbei, Sanxing, and then those North Korea, I mean entire North Korea. But again, the caveat is North Korean nuclear issue. I mean this is going to be a really difficult the thing to remove before we become even more hypothetically imagining this normalized border in North Korea and in China, and then probably in Russia and North Korea. Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me into those wonderful questions. I'll be thinking about those long term. Really appreciate it.